So we're going to have around 30 minutes or so of questions amongst us, and then as I said, we'll transition to Q&A from you all. And I think my first question builds upon some of the themes we heard yesterday about the importance of youth, but I'd say also this morning, right? We saw a few youth leaders, young leaders, discussing the importance of them being engaged in this question of racial equity and justice. And a few of you, I think principally ActionAid, Communities United, and OYA, you very much center youth at the core of your theory of change. And I'd love to first start by exploring how you think about centering youth in your racial equity work and what that actually means. And so maybe I'll start with you, Jenny, and the work that you all do at Communities United. Can you tell us a bit more about the Healing Through Justice model? You talked a little bit in your vision about how it's empowering youth in Chicago, but would love to learn a bit more. And talk perhaps a bit about how you partner with local hospitals to provide mental health services with an explicit focus on Black and Brown youth.
Sure, thank you, Marcus. So in our work and what we call our Healing Through Justice framework that was developed by youth and adult survivors in our communities, our focus is really, on first of all, doing a lot of outreach to youth who really are the most disconnected because, we want to make sure that we're really reaching young people very broadly who are the ones who are most shut out of our systems. And so our processes really focus a lot on when we meet young people, a lot of the times they feel like they and their families are the broken ones, and when they leave, they understand how the systems at play really operate and how they can play a role in changing them. And so key to that work is a lot of work around identity and lived experiences. And so we do a lot of work around narrative building and collective narrative building so that even if we come from different backgrounds, we're continually reflecting and weaving our lived experiences so that we understand how we can actually use those lived experiences to inform change. And with young people, oftentimes they've never been asked, what is your vision? What do you think needs to be different? And so in every opportunity that we have, just as it was said this morning by another speaker, we're constantly asking youth, what do you think? What does your lived experience tell you about what needs to happen differently? And then we work with young people to develop strategies to actually take action on those. And when we work with Lurie Children's Hospital, part of the goal, of course, is, if young people are in need of mental health services, of course, we work to connect them. But during the pandemic, young men and young women of color conducted participatory research where they were key drivers of a 2-year research process around issues of mental health. And what they said is that they are tired of being told that they are broken, and they really want to be lifted up and valued for the assets and the wisdom and the talents that they bring. And so in our work with Lurie Children's, the goal is not to just continue providing services, but to really fundamentally shift and reshape the entire way mental health systems operate and the way that young people are supported to become future leaders of healing over the long haul.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And I absolutely. And Shawn, I think want to maybe come to you with this question because your work very much focuses on this as well. You talked a little bit about the importance of shifting this paradigm, right? And thinking about how do you apply restorative indigenous practices to combat Western punitive methodologies. Would love for you to speak a bit more around the steps you and the broader OYA team are taking to heal youth from these generations of trauma and poverty and incarceration in the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Oh, it works. Thank you for that. And just really appreciate the focus on talking directly to youth and asking their lived experience and understanding mental health issues, which tend to be very, very pertinent to our work as well, especially dealing with children who may have suffered various sources of trauma, homelessness, multi-system involvement in child welfare services, foster care, imprisonment in the correctional facilities. In I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, Hawaii was called to task for its mistreatment of youth in our prison systems. And we were fortunate to have many judges who kind of took it upon themselves to really make change happen, and they became leaders to transform that system. I wouldn't say that it's not punitive right now, but what we are doing really well is incarcerating fewer children. And that's one way that we've begun to put youth at the center of the work. What our group is doing, our OYA, and I'm representing a collaborative here, public-private partnership, is to take that, to pick up the baton and carry it forward, as you saw in the video, and really complete the goal of ending punitive systems of care or punitive systems of treatment for our youth, and replace that with healing modalities and approaches that are rooted in our cultural values, values like aloha, which, if you break it down in a very simple way, alo is face and ha is breath. And when you approach a child and you share that breath with aloha, when we share breath with aloha, we're recognizing each other and valuing each other. And when the youth feel that they've been respected, they begin to take on a different sense of their own value. And they're respected in many ways. They're respected as workers. We respect them as community service providers. We take them to help people with help during COVID, for example, food distributions and distribution of supplies. They were on the front lines doing that work. We engage them in reconnecting with the aina, our land, which means the land is something that heals you, and if you care for it, it cares for you. Mm-hmm. And so really the land is our first teacher. And when our young people, many of them Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders who've been very disconnected with the land, when that is ignited within them, it fires off the genetic DNA makeup that is part of them, that connects them to that land, and they begin a healing process that isn't overnight. It's definitely not overnight. It takes years to actually walk with them, alongside them, supporting them through the various barriers and challenges, whether it's records expungement, whether it's dealing with court systems, judges, their own families sometimes, returning to community, finding employment, refinding employment when they lose their jobs, and walking alongside them and really having them then become the mentors and leaders to support others around them. That's one of the most privileged spaces that I've been able to watch as the young people that we've begun working with have really taken the chance to look around them and see who they're influencing, who are the younger people that are coming up behind them that they can then talk to and maybe counsel a bit. So yeah, that's one way. If there's more to that, I'll call on one of my panel members who does a lot of this work.
Thanks so much, Shawn. And I think what I really appreciate about what both of you said is it starts with asking youth, like, what do you think the problem solutions are, rather than assuming we know the answers. And it seems simple, but oftentimes is not done as much or effectively as it should be. Picking up on this question of youth and changing systems, Ana Paula, would love to bring you into this conversation, because we saw in the video and we heard from you this very incredible ambition to develop an anti-racist education for Black and Brown and Quilombola children in Brazil. And would love to hear from you, like, what would that actually mean or look like? And perhaps speak to us a bit about what impact the current education system and the content that is currently being utilized is having on Black and Brown and Quilombola children in Brazil.
Português, novamente. Bom, é um enorme desafio. É um enorme desafio porque estamos falando de uma população gigantesca, com grandes diferenças entre elas, entre as regiões brasileiras, com índices muito diferentes entre si. Eu acho que é fundamental a gente pensar que no Brasil, e aí eu faço o link com a questão da juventude, né, de você trazer as organizações e os diferentes parceiros para pensar junto as soluções. Então, a gente tem aí um bom tempo e uma herança muito consolidada de experiências que foram muito bem-sucedidas, de projetos que foram realizados, implementados com muito sucesso, e o SETA vem tentando, o projeto SETA, o nosso projeto, vem tentando organizar e trabalhar com todas essas experiências. Então, a gente não sai do nada, né? Não é alguma coisa que a gente precisa criar do zero. A gente está aqui pensando sistemicamente como a gente pode oferecer para os estados e municípios, que é a estrutura de educação do Brasil, soluções que caibam nas suas necessidades. Não é nada de top-down, não é nada que vem de fora para dentro, é algo que é construído a partir das experiências locais. E, ao se pensar essas soluções, a gente tem que ter em mente a questão da interseccionalidade, né? A gente vai sempre pensar em como trabalhar com essas diferentes opressões que a gente se defronta nos territórios, com as nossas crianças, nossas juventudes, e pensar que, para entender e enfrentar esse problema, a gente precisa estar atento à questão do sexismo, à questão do racismo, como a questão econômica, como elas se sobrepõem. E a gente trabalha, como eu falei atrás, agora há pouco, a gente trabalha com a juventude negra e periférica, mas também com a juventude indígena e quilombola. São experiências muito diferentes e são questões muito específicas de cada um desses grupos que a gente precisa, de alguma forma, dar conta. Então, é muito específico. E, para a gente, é tudo, né? É fundamental a educação antirracista, a educação para a equidade racial, ela é fundamental nesse momento do Brasil. Porque o que a gente viveu ao longo da nossa história é um apagamento da nossa história, um não reconhecimento, um não lugar da população negra, da população indígena, da população quilombola. Nós não sabemos, nós não aprendemos, não tivemos oportunidade de aprender nada sobre essa história nos nossos livros didáticos, na nossa escola, nas nossas aulas. Isso significa um apagamento. Ao mesmo tempo, quando a gente tem toda a influência eurocêntrica na educação brasileira, a gente, ao mesmo tempo que apaga a nossa história, a gente cria um mito de que o ideal é um ideal branco. Então, a criança, ela, ao mesmo tempo que não tem as suas referências, que perde as suas referências, ela também dá uma falsa impressão de que o ideal é o branco, que aquela cultura é, sim, a que ela deveria aprender, ou que ela deveria sentir. Isso cria um auto-ódio, né? Cria um sentimento, é uma enorme violência, né? Então, a gente está falando não só de uma violência letal, que também é muito significativa no Brasil, mas de uma violência subjetiva e cotidiana, com a qual as nossas crianças estão todas enfrentando no dia a dia.
Thank you for sharing, and I think unfortunately many of us operate in contexts where as you were saying, the ideal is the white, and that becomes the baseline of everything, and how do you begin to shift that perception? So thank you for sharing the work that you and your team are doing. We also, yesterday, a lot of conversations also centered on the importance of land, even starting with the land acknowledgement. And the work of both India Law Resource Center Juanita and Namati, Eileen, really focus on control of land as a means to racial equity. And so would love to hear your thoughts on this. And so perhaps we'll start with you, Juanita, and then over to you, Eileen. Juanita, you spoke a little bit about this, but can you help us understand the importance of legal representation for Indigenous people as it relates to control over land? And we've spoken in the past about sometimes there are consequences that land activists face to even trying to defend their land. Would love for you to talk a bit more about the work you're doing and this importance of the legal representation that you think is really critical.
Thank you. So I guess I want to begin with an example of what we hope to achieve with this Indigenous Lands Initiative. Historically, as I had mentioned earlier, when Indigenous peoples, we have historically lived in our lands and our territories. And it has been through waves of dispossession, of displacement, over, in some contexts, more than 500 years, depending on when colonization began in our lands and territories. And as I had mentioned earlier, this has caused structural inequalities, exclusion that are completely embedded in laws, in systems that have reduced our humanity and that have not allowed us to be recognized as peoples. Many times we're considered extinct. And in most extreme cases, there is orchestrated state-sponsored violence of extermination, genocide. All of this has had consequences that we see today. The fact that indigenous peoples, who are a small majority in the world's population, are fighting for survival, and at the same time that we're fighting for survival, we are also preserving about 85% of the world's biodiversity. Because we are a part of our lands, our territories, as we heard from other relatives on this stage, that we are a reflection of the earth that we live on. So what this means is that because indigenous peoples do not have legal recognized certainty over our lands and territories, this is one of the biggest threats to the survival of indigenous peoples, and really to Mother Earth. And what this has seen, and here I go into the example, in my lands and territories, I'm Maya Mum from Ishimuleo, which is now known as Guatemala. We are seeing the theft of our lands and territories not as something from 500 years ago, but as violent evictions that are occurring even just 2 weeks ago. Large-scale militarization, persecution, criminalization, and assassinations. In order for us to thrive as peoples, as nations, individuals, and collectively, we must be allowed the opportunity to live without fear, to live without violence, and to live without discrimination. When we talk about bringing racial equality to indigenous peoples, at the core of this is land rights, because that ensures our survival. That means that we have the right as sovereign nations to say what happens in our lands and territories, to make decisions, to consent or to not to consent to projects. Transnational corporations are invading indigenous lands across the globe. But it's not just transnational and extractivism. It's also clean development mechanisms. It's also agro-industry. This is all closely tied to climate change, to forced migration, and to intergenerational trauma, which has already been discussed. At the core of all of these things is land. And so what we're really hoping for in this vision with indigenous peoples from the Brazilian Amazon, from the Peruvian Amazon, but really as we look at the next years in the project, the next 8 years, we're looking at a network, mobilizing indigenous leadership, because this too has been something that has not been given to us. We haven't been recognized for our solutions, for our leadership, and for our autonomy. So what this project allows us to do, and my colleague who's also sitting here, Chris Foley, will likely expand on this in Q&A, is it allows us to provide systems change so that indigenous peoples can reclaim our humanity and also be allowed to survive as distinct nations. So when we're looking at the solutions and structural change, we're looking at working in 8 countries, working with 45 to 100 communities, and we're looking at reclaiming land title to hundreds of thousands of hectares. How amazing would that look like in terms of us reclaiming what has historically been ours, but not just for indigenous peoples, for humanity.
Thank you so much, Juanita. And Eileen, of course, the work of Namati is very closely related to much of what we've heard. And you all work at the intersection of climate justice, racism, and control over land. Would love for you to also share your perspective on this particular point of how those various points are intertwined for you in Namati, and what could greater control over land mean, not just for the communities that you work with, but also perhaps for broader communities that people in this room are also working with.
Good, thanks Marcus. In my introduction, I focused on communities with less power. But for us to talk about communities with less power, we must also talk about companies that cause the environmental harm, that have both political and economic power. And so across the focus countries that we work with, besides the fact that these companies have more power, we're looking at communities that constantly have insecure tenure rights, as has been discussed. And so in Kenya, where I come from, our work is centered among indigenous and local communities, most of whom practice pastoralism, and their relationship to their land is extremely personal, spiritual, and a sense of their identity. And if you look at what has happened in the last few years, including now, we've witnessed the worst drought that has been seen in the last 4 decades. What this means is that for communities that have had their own indigenous systems of climate resilience, that the intensity of drought has stretched even their own resilience, and yet their contribution to some of this harm that is being caused by external parties is almost insignificant. And so we constantly see projects that are pushing us to transition to clean energy, and we all want to do that. But one of the things that we're asking is that these projects should not be at the expense of people, at the expense of indigenous and local communities. A few weeks ago, one of the largest wind power plant has been challenged by a community in the northern part of Kenya, because this wind power plant acquired 150,000 land for a small indigenous community. And that meant that this community had to move to give way to the huge turbines that keep moving. But the most fascinating thing is that this community, where these huge turbines have been constructed, have no connectivity to the grid, and so they constantly have to use firewood. And so as we are pushing the world and my world to transition to clean energy, nobody is thinking about communities in Turkana, communities in Marsabit, where huge turbines have given way, have pushed them out of their land, and yet their connectivity, it means nothing to them because they are not connected to the grid. The heart of it is for communities to have their tenure rights secured. It means greater bargaining power. It means the ability to be able to push back. It means the ability to be able to construct and reconstruct their systems of climate change resilience. It means a process of being able to collectively bargain, because the first instance is that their tenure rights are secured. And so in Kenya and in Sierra Leone and in other countries where laws exist and are not being implemented, laws that otherwise would have given communities a right to be able to own their land, is what we are working to be able to change. We want to see laws not just a preserve of well-dressed attorneys, but laws being placed in the hands of ordinary people, that they're able to relate and translate what this law means to them on a daily basis, and being able to leverage on that law to push and hold companies and governments too to account, and ensure that their tenure rights are secured for greater collective bargaining power.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Eileen. So we're going to ask one more question amongst us, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. And so please do, if you have questions, begin to think through those. As I said, that will also be an opportunity to hear from others who are working across these organizations. So the next question, yesterday we had the opportunity to visit the Apartheid Museum and reflect on, I was really struck by the various roles that Nelson Mandela played over the course of his career, and recognizing that in the fight for liberation, the importance of evolving and shifting and being mindful of which tactics are available to you now and are needed now that perhaps were not available 10, 15 years ago. Can you each speak to new ways in which you're trying to engage people in your work that may not necessarily have been as common decades ago or even years ago? And I actually would love to stay with you, Eileen, and then perhaps go this way down the panel, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. some of these tactics are not absolutely new, but they keep evolving because of the way the world is evolving. I think we are seeing the rise of authoritarian leadership across most of our countries. State of anarchy, where even laws that are supposed to protect people, that even governments themselves do not respect some of those laws. And so, reflecting on Mandela, and even the apartheid regime appreciated the fact that they needed to put him in solitary rooms to ensure that they are not able to connect with other people. And so part of that which we are constantly trying to do is being able to build a community beyond the boundaries of countries that are able to constantly connect and build power, collective power across the globe. And we convene the Grassroots Justice Network that is about bringing together justice, justice seekers, justice workers, to constantly connect, because one of the things that's happening across is that the company that comes and creates harm in my country will also go to her country and your country. And if we're able to constantly build the power, then we're able to put pressure, not just in our countries, because sometimes in the countries, the systems do not work, but we are able to build and put pressure globally. And so just learning from Mandela, the power of constantly evolving and building power beyond the boundaries of our countries. Of course, we first have to start to build power within, and that's what our Grassroots Justice Network is about, building power within communities, and then moving beyond communities to building global power, to holding power, because it's the power imbalance that constantly creates space and feeds environmental racism. And so for us, we must start to dismantle this power and shift power to real people, because they are the real power holders. And that's exactly what we're doing.
Thank you. Juanita?
Yeah, I'd also like to piggyback on the collective nature of shifting, of transformative change. I think in our situation, one of the things that there has always been Indigenous leadership, Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous advocacy, and really it has been Indigenous leadership who has pushed for this change at the United Nations, at different areas, so that we actually have things like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It was our elders who helped pave the way for that change. However, what has oftentimes been the case is that Indigenous peoples have been marginalized even within movements, because we haven't been really recognized, and we haven't been invited into spaces. And so now I think what we're seeing is a couple of things, and there's reflective of leadership that we saw yesterday. And really it's one, looking at the change within those who are most directly impacted and bringing that knowledge into the fora. But two is also understanding that we can't do this fight alone, so kind of building on that solidarity. Building alliances with perhaps unlikely partners, building alliances in solidarity within our struggles, but centering and honoring Indigenous leadership at its core, Indigenous strategies and ways of knowing at its core. But this means that we need to work with non-Indigenous allies. We need to work perhaps, as is mentioned, within the shareholder strategy and advocacy change that we also saw, the grassroots organizing. But really now, with the support that we're getting with this tremendous project, is scaling up. So really inviting all of you to join us in this partnership of protecting lands, building future, and really seeking racial justice, racial equity across the globe.
Thank you.
Building on of what they both said, I think a key opportunity in this time is not just the focus on leadership, but truly sustainable leadership, because that's what we're going to need to be able to see transformative change and the type of local and global power that we're talking about today. And I think that, we've probably all seen this in our communities, in my organization, when grandmothers, bring their 5-year-olds to meetings, right? They begin to get this taste of what it really looks like to be able to create change. And they sit and they listen, they observe, they participate. And then, 20 years later, those same folks are the ones who are leading this global racial equity initiative, right? And so to me, that's just the huge potential of this moment is as I think communities across the world are, embedding sustainable leadership into all of the work, we just see that the vision that we're trying to work towards is truly possible.
Ditto, ditto, ditto. All really good points that also are relevant to our work. And, pivoting is constant in our project. And the tricky part is working alongside the state and Western systems that don't see things through our eyes and that are much slower to move than the really urgent pace that we have, the intensity of change that we seek. And so we have to think about the long haul, and then we also have to think about young lives that are in danger every single day that we're hoping to support, we're working to support. So the innovation, the pivots, and I loved seeing the history that we learned about yesterday and all of that, and feeling all of the emotion that came along with those visits that we did, the pain, the hurt, the anger I felt was really not surprising, I guess, but it was intense, and so I was very tired at the end of the day. But at the same time, triumph and resiliency and what it takes to be committed to really create change. And so I know that we hope in 8 years we're going to solve this thing. We're going to take it across the globe. Yes, we're going to do that. We're going to do our very best. But in the event that it happens after I'm not here, what we need to do is create, build the platform for the next group of people that's going to keep on pushing forward and not be afraid of speaking up and taking on, really having those courageous conversations that we talked about yesterday. And in our state, it's a very reluctant place to have courageous conversations. And so we have Plan B, which is we'll do it on our own. If we can't do it in their time, we're not going to get it done in the state's time, we have our Plan B where we're going to figure out how to do it ourselves, and with a probably more active advocacy stance. And there's also Plan C and D. So I think the ability to have multiple tactics always present in your mind is a necessity. Otherwise, you fail. You're doomed, right? So.
Ana Paula?
Eu acredito que o projeto SETA tem duas grandes inovações e que dialogam bastante com o que a gente aprendeu ontem nas visitas, né? A primeira grande questão é que ninguém faz nada sozinho, né? É preciso todo mundo para poder fazer alguma transformação. Então, o Projeto SETA trabalha com muitas outras organizações. Nós somos uma coalizão de 6 organizações, mas, ao nosso redor, tem várias outras organizações, grupos, especialistas, universidades, que estão junto com a gente, pensando esse sistema de educação que estará disponibilizado para qualquer secretaria que se interesse por. Então, acho que isso é uma inovação e dá uma escalabilidade para o projeto e dá a ele uma longa vida, né, que é o que a gente quer. A segunda questão que eu acho que é super relevante é esse olhar sistêmico que o projeto tem para a questão da educação, né? A gente produz e produzirá e continuará produzindo muitas pesquisas, desenvolvendo metodologias com os parceiros, fazendo diálogos com diferentes públicos, seja ele com o Estado, se necessário for, com os diferentes níveis do Estado. Enfim, essa questão de olhar sistemicamente para a educação e reconhecendo que ela é uma responsabilidade de todos, eu acho que ela é fundamental também para que haja um sucesso do projeto. E aí, inspirado no Mandela, que ele está lá escrito, né, que a educação é a ferramenta mais poderosa para transformar o mundo, a gente acredita fielmente nisso, de que a educação é transformadora, e que é preciso todo mundo junto para conseguir fazer isso, para conseguir transformar.
Thank you. And that quote also stood out to me. So I just want to do a quick time check because this says around 16 minutes. Is that accurate, or do we want to? I just want to make sure that we're using time. Do you have that?
So what we'll do is we will open for at least 2 or 3 questions
Okay.
just to see how the answers are going to run. So we do have the team ready with microphones if you're ready to then go into the Q&A section.
Absolutely.
Is that okay?
Yep, absolutely.
Fantastic. We've got a question there.
Hola, muchas gracias. Mi nombre es Zenón Gomel, de Perú. Y tengo una pregunta dirigida para Juanita. Por supuesto, vamos a conversar más luego. El proyecto es del territorio y en estos tiempos es fundamental ver nuevos paradigmas en cuanto a la naturaleza. Desde las comunidades indígenas, consideramos a la madre naturaleza como un ser viviente, nuestra madre, que contiene todos los elementos vitales, aguas, ríos, nubes, animales. En buena cuenta, se requiere de la equidad con la naturaleza. Ese pensamiento que hace la separación del ser humano, y no cualquier ser humano, sino occidental, más que la naturaleza, está conllevando a la actual crisis social, climática, e incluso se habla de la crisis civilizatoria. Si es que no consideramos a la madre naturaleza como nuestra madre, es probable que no tengamos equidad, ni con la naturaleza, ni entre seres humanos, ni equidad racial. Entonces, es fundamental considerar esta dimensión. En su proyecto, ¿cómo se está tomando en cuenta esto que acabo de mencionar? Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Are you who?
Or are you doing round? Selecting,
Perhaps
or-
in the interest of time, you were asking someone specific, right? You said, who did you ask the question to?
I think Juanita.
Yeah, I think it was
directed to you.
Juanita.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't know if you were going to take a couple of questions and then we
No,
would
we can do
answer.
it one at a time. It's probably
Okay.
more effective that way.
Okay. I would actually, thank you so much for the question. I'd actually like to invite my colleague, Chris Foley, also with Indian Law Research Center, to help share the space of answering the question.
Okay, great.
Or perhaps pass the microphone.
It's a microphone.
Okay.
Good morning, and thank you. Chris Foley. I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation and a senior attorney at the Indian Law Resource Center. And I thank you very much for your question. There's a number of answers to that question. Our project is intended to center Indigenous rights in everything that we do, and to center Indigenous decision-making. You're absolutely right that Indigenous people's values surrounding Mother Nature, surrounding Mother Earth, and environmental values are essential in solving many global problems that we face. That's something that Juanita has mentioned already. I think that one of the things that, one of the questions that you asked is sort of, this broad question of how do we center, how are we going to take these values into account in our project? So our project is intentionally collective in exercise and design. So we work as an Indigenous organization, pardon, with other Indigenous organizations in Peru, with IDACEP and with Coyabi in Brazil. And those are also composed of, those organizations represent and work with Indigenous communities at the regional and national levels in their countries. So our decision-making is entirely grassroots, comes from the grassroots level and incorporates the values of grassroots villages, of grassroots communities, of Indigenous nations, including values surrounding Mother Earth. So those core indigenous values permeate everything that we do, all the way through from figuring out which lands need to be titled first for whatever cultural reasons, spiritual reasons that need to be done or need to be taken into account, all the way through every stage of the project. So incorporating and instantiating indigenous values is the core of what we're doing in this project. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We do have a number of questions for the panels, but I think the beauty is that we are encouraging networking and people getting to know all of you as well individually. So in the interest of time, we're going to take one more question, but please, if you could avail yourself during the tea break so people can then come to you directly to ask you the questions, because we have a number of questions in the room, which is fantastic if people want, to collaborate and speak about this topic.
Yes, I have the mic. My name is Chimwemwe Sakunda Ziovo, and I'm from Malawi. I work with Kaitas Malawi. I'm a fellow for Kellogg. My question is specific to my sister tomorrow. You said it's tomorrow. Sorry, I can't pronounce your name. But anyway, I think I'm much interested because I'm also from Africa, and I think your presentation touched on climate change issues, which I guess all of us, we know that now Africa is one of the continents that is most affected by the climate change-induced challenges. So I just wanted to ask, what's the scope of your project? Because you mentioned that you are from Kenya, but I think you gave an example from Sierra Leone. So I just want to know, for curiosity's sake, what's the scope? I'm asking this because Malawi is one of the countries that is also facing a lot of disaster climate-induced challenges. Like now, we are grappling with Cyclone Freddy, which hit the country and really destroyed a lot of properties, including schools. As I'm saying, some schools have not been opened yet because they are used as camps, and that is also affecting a lot of students, learners in terms of education. So I just wanted to find out what is your take and how can we or else maybe benefit from the program? A country such as Malawi and many other countries, of course. Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you very much for that question. Allow me to invite my colleague, Eleanor, to just share the platform with me.
Good morning. Thank you, Chimwemwe, for your question. My name is Eleanor Thompson. I'm from Sierra Leone, and along with my colleague, Eileen, we work with Namati across 4 countries under this project to advance communities being centered at the forefront of knowing and understanding their land rights, building power, organizing and building power, and utilizing those to disrupt systems in which, whether it's corporations or governments or whoever, are exercising control of land in a way that is harmful to communities of color and communities that are systematically disadvantaged. Those countries that we are primarily focused on are Kenya, Sierra Leone, the United States, specific communities communities of color in the United States. We also, as my colleague Eileen mentioned, help convene a grassroots global network of justice actors who are convening around issues of land and environmental justice. And because of the work that's being done in the countries that we focus on, we're able to, through the involvement of communities, through the voices of communities, build local knowledge of what's happening, what are some of the environmental changes that are occurring from harms created by whether it's development projects or the effects of climate change, and feed that into advocacy at continental and global levels through the movement that's being built. So we're looking not only at country-level interventions, but how to feed this global to build power around changing systems of inequality, around development that lead to environmental, or that underscore environmental.
Great. Thank you very much. So I know that we have to wrap, and so maybe we'll just encourage you all to ask questions this time we said of these wonderful leaders and their colleagues. A few quick themes, 30 seconds, is that I heard emphasis on sustainable leadership and thinking about the next generation of leadership. I heard a lot around collaboration, and perhaps collaboration with folks you previously would not have worked with, but recognizing the importance of that, and authentic youth and community engagement. And so thank you all for sharing your perspectives and for your partnership in this initiative as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You took my line, because I wanted to say a round of applause for Marcus and the panel.
We can still do it.
Clap.